Okay, this is going to be the first AP lecture, first set of notes, and this roughly corresponds with the first chapter in your textbook. This set of notes we will call Europeans and the New World. The first thing that I'd like to talk about are Native Americans and the people that they are the people that existed in the Americas prior to European exploration, European arrival. Most historians believe that the Americas were peopled by people that originally came over from Asia and across what is today the Bering Strait, a body of water that separates Siberia, the western part of Europe, Russia, from Alaska. But back in the Ice Age, the water levels were lower, and so there was actually a land bridge, and people could walk across, and they did, and they were in search of big game, food, their source of food. They were hunter-gatherer people, and so this is how, again, people came across from Asia, across what is today the Bering Strait during the Ice Age, and then came down into the Americas. And once they got into the Americas, they separated, settled in various areas, and a great diversity began to develop amongst these people. And one of the big things I want you to get out of this and make note of right here is the amount of diversity. A lot of times people think of Indians as kind of this monolithic one type of people. Someone says an Indian or a Native American, you think of a particular image in your head, but there was a great, tremendous amount of diversity in the peoples in the Americas prior to the Europeans arriving. And we'll talk about that here. You can see in this image, just in North America, here is a kind of map that shows you the various different tribes that existed. And each of these tribes had often their own language, their own ways of living that could be radically different than another tribe. So again, there was a great diversity that existed amongst the native peoples. The thing that created and was most responsible for creating this great diversity amongst Native Americans was the environment. People had to adapt their way of living to their environment. So if you live in a cold climate, you're going to obviously have different types of clothing than if you are living in a desert, in the type of area that is today, say, New Mexico and Arizona. You're going to not have as much clothing as the native people, say, that lived in what is today Canada or Alaska. The types of houses and dwellings differed markedly due to, again, their environment. And over here you see a collection of different types of native dwellings. Here, of course, is the igloo. Most of you, I'm sure, are aware this is a dwelling made out of ice and snow, and this would be someone living in Western Canada or Alaska, those places today. Here you see pueblos. These are made out of clay and dirt and look almost like apartment buildings, but these are the type of dwellings you would find in places that are today the states of Arizona and New Mexico. And then you see all kinds of other dwellings made out of the resources that were available wherever these peoples lived. The other thing, they had, some groups were hunter-gatherers. That is, they hunt, they gather whatever berries exist in their locale, and then once they exhaust those, they have to go on the move. They're nomadic people, and they would most generally have, of course, teepees, kind of like our modern-day tents, where you can pack that up, move, set it down wherever you need to be for a while, and keep going. Other native tribes were sedentary. That is, they stayed in one area. Those types of native peoples obviously knew how to farm. They knew how to have kind of modern agriculture where they knew how to plant seeds, grow things repetitively. And they had, of course, more fixed structures like things like this. One thing that was, so while there was a lot of diversity amongst native people, there were some commonalities as well. And most historians that have spent a lot of time studying Native American peoples found that overwhelmingly there were specific gender roles that existed no matter what the tribe was and where it was. For instance, most men tended to be hunters and warriors, and most women tended to be involved in agriculture, preparing food, those kind of things. So there were specific gender roles regardless of where the native peoples worked. But all in all, a lot of diversity, and there was not just one kind of native peoples that were here when the Europeans arrived. Here are some images again to kind of reinforce the point that we're talking about. So here you can see someone that's kind of scantily clothed. This is an image from a European artist, some of the first Europeans that came here. Here you can see photographs, and you can see Eskimos heavily clothed. Here's a kind of a Midwest Indian, and again, different dwellings. Here's a pueblo, there's an igloo, but hopefully you get the point. A lot of diversity. That's the theme here. Now, speaking of diversity, some native peoples developed much more complex civilizations than did others. And the more complex societies were generally in Central and South America. And these societies, these groups of people, you should have learned about in middle school. They are the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayans. These are part of the 6th and 7th grade history standards for California. So you should have learned at length about all of these peoples. But again, the Aztecs were located in what is today Mexico, the Incas and the Mayans in Central America, and then South America, the Incas were in what is today Peru. And these were much more complex civilizations. Here's an image of the Aztecs, big city in what is today is Mexico City, and you see a gigantic pyramid-shaped structure. They had huge buildings, a gigantic city that rivaled any Europe at the time, as a matter of fact. And so this is much more complex than, you know, they have a social hierarchy and things like that, than the smaller kind of tribes that existed in what is today the United States. So the main point here, the more complex societies, these three, lived in Central and South America. The ones that lived in what is today the United States were smaller, not as complex, didn't have gigantic buildings and structures and as much social hierarchy as did these groups. So let's stop for a second and go over quickly, since nobody's here, but if we were doing this live, I would ask some sort of people in the crowd, students, these questions. So by now, hopefully, you want to know how the first people got to the Americas, what the biggest factor in shaping Native American cultures was, and where in the Americas were the most developed civilizations. So if you know these three things, give yourself a pat on the back, whatever, and let's move on. Right now, we're going to switch gears and talk about European motivations for exploration. And the big thing was, what caused, in other words, Europeans to search out and come into contact with the Americas? And the basic thing, I think most of you know, the basic motivation was they were looking for new trade routes to Asia. Now, Europeans, and here's Europe, and here's where they want to get, India, China, had come into contact with Asia and were intrigued with the goods. And a lot of this happened either through the Crusades, this series of wars to kind of recapture the Holy Land, where then when they fought wars there, they came into contact with goods that had come across here. It says the Silk Road, and wow, these are cool things: spices, silks, porcelain, and also some famous travelers like Marco Polo, who was an adventurer who had traveled to China and India and then come back to Europe. He wrote about his experiences, and this fired the imagination of many Europeans. So through the Crusades, through travelogues of people like Marco Polo, and through the small amount of goods Europeans had been able to get back to Europe, Europeans really wanted to figure out how to get over here to experience, but mostly to get these goods, these trade goods there that they had gotten a taste of. The problem with this was the land routes were controlled primarily by Muslims, and the Muslims And the Europeans really were kind of at loggerheads. They did not get along. They had fought a series of wars to control the Middle East, known as the Crusades by Europeans. And so because the Muslims controlled the land routes and the Mediterranean, this sea route here, it made trying to get the trade goods from Asia both dangerous and expensive. Okay, so it was dangerous because hostile Muslims control this area and you might be able to get through, but it was expensive because goods from here to purchase them here or anywhere go through a lot of different hands and middlemen, and each time a good is sold from one to another, the price increases. So what happened then was Europeans started to try to figure out a way to be able to get goods from this area without having to go through the Muslim dominated world here. And so obviously you're going to look for sea routes. Now the thing is, again, I think most of you are aware of this, that you learned at some point in your life, they did not know the Americas were over here to the west. So a lot of people thought you just sail some way over this way and you'll come out, of course, over here. The first people to try, though, are going to go south, and hopefully that's the next slide. I can't remember the order. Oops, well, that'll be the slide after this. Anyway, I just went over why Europeans were interested in sea exploration, but you need more than just a want. You also have to have the ability to do something, how to do it. And Europeans were able to when they discovered some new technology. And most of this technology, interestingly enough, came from the Muslim world. The Muslims at the time in the 1400s, 1300s, 1400s, early 1400s, were much more scientifically advanced than Europeans. A lot of historians have written about how the church domination of European society had really stifled a lot of scientific thought, because if your scientific theories contradicted anything that the church or the Bible said, you would be branded a heretic and your life could be in danger. So Europe was not really a hotbed of scientific thought at that time. Plus they had just come back from the Black Plague, and Europe had had a lot of difficulties. But the Muslim world in the 1300s, early 1400s was much more advanced in scientific kind of know-how. But once Europeans again had some contact with these peoples, they started to borrow from them technology such as the astrolabe, this device here, which allows people to navigate based on stars. That led to better cartology, which is the study of making maps and better maps, and then also the development of a better ship. And that's the caravel, this vessel here. The big thing was triangular sails. Prior to the caravel, people had square sails, kind of centered, not as much maneuverability. This allows you much more maneuverability, this vessel here. So the caravel was instrumental in allowing Europeans to go farther and take more advantage of winds than they ever had previously. And again, the caravel borrowed from Muslim design. The Muslims were the people that had come up with those types of sails. The other thing, besides the advent of new technology, mostly gathered from the Muslim world by Europeans, was the development of kind of modern nation states. To finance voyages of exploration, it took great amounts of money, resources, and only big nation states could fund these. So we'll talk about in a minute the Reconquista, the uniting of Castile and Aragon to create modern-day Spain, and how that created a large nation state that could finance such voyages. But anyway, the two things that allow for Europeans to go on voyages of exploration: better technology, development of nation states. Now, the country that first took the lead in Europe looking for sea routes to Asia was Portugal. Portugal, hopefully you know, is on the Iberian Peninsula, so it is borders the Atlantic Ocean. So a lot of people there were fishermen, people that made their living and were experienced sailors. And the leading figure in Portuguese exploration was this gentleman here, Prince Henry the Navigator, a member of the royal family. He started a school for sailors and trained, developed, and kind of sponsored a lot of voyages of exploration for the Portuguese. The first things the Portuguese did were, when they started to venture out into the oceans, were conquer the islands offshore, the Azores, the Canary Islands, and then after that they started to head south, trying to get to Asia, and it's there they came into contact with Africa. Now that was something that was of historical significance, because it was there when the Portuguese started to come into contact with Africa that they first started to get slaves from Africa and then take them back to these islands to grow sugar, but also back to Europe. So this was the beginning of Europeans being involved in the slave trade from Africa. Now it's important to note, and slavery will be something we'll talk about a lot in the class. It's a big part, of course, of U.S. history. But one thing to note is Europeans did not create slavery in Africa. It existed prior to Europeans arriving. Africans had a tradition in that country of when a tribe went to war with another tribe, they enslaved the losers. People would sell themselves into slavery if they were in debt. People would sell people in their own family into slavery for debt, things like that. But there was already a tradition in Africa of people enslaving one another. Europeans, of course, greatly impacted that. They created a desire amongst Africans once Europeans showed up and wanted slaves, that Africans then started to go out of their way to get slaves more than the traditional thing. So the Europeans impacted that, but the Europeans did not just come there and that started slavery in Africa. Africans were already enslaving each other. The Portuguese would come to the coast of Africa and trade goods, European goods, for slaves, and then take them to these islands and grew sugar. And this, again, is the beginning of Europeans in the African slave trade. Here you see a map of what we're talking about. Again, this is a little odd for me doing this without any people in here, and I apologize if it's kind of rusty and fragmented. Anyway, Portugal is here, this country on the Iberian Peninsula. The rest of it is Spain, and you can see they're trying to get, here's India, China, and they're going here. They're conquering islands out here first, then they're going down here and a little further and a little further, and then finally they get down to the Cape of Good Hope, and then finally they get all the way around that. So a series of voyages, but as they're going south, trying to get over here, they come into contact again with Africans on the coast, and it's there they start purchasing slaves and taking them back. Let's shift over now to Spain. So Portugal kind of took the lead in European exploration, looking for a sea route to Asia. Spain, though, probably had the biggest impact as far as world history. Modern Spain was created by the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. This united, well, before there was modern Spain, there were a series of kingdoms. You can see Castile, Aragon, Granada, etc. So the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella united the two biggest kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, created modern Spain. Now, not only did this create a large nation state, but it gave them the resources, Ferdinand and Isabella, to drive the Muslims, who are the Moors, from the Iberian Peninsula. So the Muslim world, as I told you, in the 1300s, had gotten, not only controlled all of northern Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean, but had even gotten into what is today Spain and controlled a good deal of Spain. When Ferdinand and Isabella married, though, their big deal was to try to reconquer, which the word for that is the Reconquista, the Iberian Peninsula. That is, drive the Muslims out and make it a Catholic country. So Ferdinand and Isabella, their forces are successful finally. The same year that Columbus goes is the same year they finally drive Muslims completely out of the Iberian Peninsula. That's 1492. Now, there was a huge, again, religious component to this. Isabella in particular was a devout Catholic, and so this is a war not just to rule over this territory, but for religious domination. It's a very spirited drive influenced by Catholicism to take over this land, drive out infidels, drive out the Muslims. While the Muslims ruled here, they were a lot more religiously tolerant, actually, than Ferdinand and Isabella will be once they control the area. When the Muslims ruled this area, they had Muslims living here, a large amount of Jews, and Catholics, all living kind of together, but ruled by the Muslims. When Ferdinand and Isabella drive the Muslims out, they force everybody that's left to convert to Catholicism or else be punished. And you should have learned about that in middle school as well. That's the Inquisition, and they kind of force people, again, lots of Jews convert to Catholicism that lived there because or else they would have been punished. So there's this kind of religious spirit in the Reconquista that drove modern day Spain to drive these people out and then continue to drive on, that we'll see, into the New World. And their attitudes when they get to the New World, again, are influenced by kind of a religious zeal of dominating other peoples, driving out other peoples. So anyway, this is the creation of modern day Spain, and the spirit of this is going to be present in their explorations as well. This kind of religious zeal of spreading Catholicism and dominating non-Catholic peoples. So we'll stop again for some review here. What you should know by now are the factors that motivated European exploration. Again, looking for trade routes, alternative non-land routes or non-Mediterranean routes to Asia. What developments led to Europeans being able to explore? And again, better technology, most of it borrowed from the Muslim world, and development of modern nation states. What country took the lead in European sea exploration? Where did they go? What led to the unification of Spain? What was the Reconquista, and how did it play a part in Spanish exploration? So you should know all of that from the last batch of slides. So let's continue on. A central figure in Spanish exploration, the central figure without a doubt, the most famous person, Christopher Columbus. Columbus, pictured here, was not of Spanish origin. He was born in Genoa in Italy, in what is today Italy. This is before the unification of Italy. He was a very accomplished sailor, and he had the idea of going west to look for a sea route to Asia, not south as the Portuguese had been doing. People at the time, though, it's a myth that people thought the earth was flat and he was going to fall off. Most people in Europe knew the earth was round. They knew it wasn't the fact that they thought if you went west you were going to fall off. They simply thought, though, it was too far, that the ships could not carry enough fresh water and food to go westward from Europe to Asia, and that's why no one had attempted that. It's a myth that they were going to fall off the edge of the earth or that the earth was flat. So Columbus actually went to many other countries to kind of sell the idea of going west and look for sponsorship, and he was rejected in hand by Portugal, by France, and by Spain. He tried all of those countries, or not Spain, by England, France, and Portugal, before he finally went to Spain, trying to get sponsored on this westward voyage to Asia. He was able to sell Ferdinand and Isabella on this scheme, and they sponsored him, gave him 3 ships. Most of you probably know from being a kid, Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and he sailed westward looking for a sea route to Asia, although again it took him multiple tries of getting sponsorship. But Columbus's big deal, he wants to go west rather than south to find a sea route to Asia. Here is an artist's depiction of Columbus trying to convince Ferdinand and Isabella in their court here, you see, of sponsoring his voyage for westward sea route to Asia. The first voyage of Columbus took place in 1492. When I was a kid, we were usually brainwashed by this catchy little jingle thing, you know, in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So it was 1492. He sailed west, and the first land that he encountered was an island in what is today the Bahamas, and he met native peoples there. There will be some primary sources I'm going to ask you to access online that will you'll read his accounts of these meetings, but he met these people. They obviously much different than Europeans. You'll read about his depiction of them and his encounter with them. After that, he moved on and later landed on what are today Cuba and an island that he named Hispaniola, that today is an island that has two countries on it, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So these are islands just south of present-day Florida. That's where Columbus lands in his first voyages. He then left, I believe it was 39 or 40 people on Hispaniola, and took back some Native Americans and some plants from the area and went back to Spain. He was convinced, not that he had found a new continent or anything, but he was just on the outskirts of Asia. Okay? He still doesn't think he's found a new continent or anything like that. He's just found some islands nobody knew that existed that are, and Asia should just be a little more if you continue west. But he left some people, Spaniards here, went back to Spain. People were very excited. They gave him many more ships and more people, and he went back. When he comes back to Hispaniola, he found that the Native Americans had killed all the Spaniards that he had left. Apparently they had had some sort of disagreement, obviously, and the natives killed all the Spaniards. So that didn't sit well with Columbus and his people, and then they reacted harshly in kind on their second voyage back. Here you see, all in all, Columbus made 4 voyages from Spain to the New World, and if you look closely, you will see where he lands are, here again is Cuba, here's Hispaniola, here are the first islands he landed on, and then he actually went into what is today Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, but you can see, and even South America, Columbus never came into contact with anything that is today the United States. So a lot of times people are confused when they say Columbus discovered America. He discovered the Americas, okay, but he never set foot in any land that is the present-day United States. But he set in motion many other explorers then that came after him that obviously then people do search out here, everywhere. So the impact of Columbus was he created a European awareness. These things were here and spurred many more people after him from various countries that came to the Americas. And it will be other Spanish explorers that go into what is today Florida, and the English go into these places, and the French up here, and we'll get to those things shortly. So the impact of Columbus's voyage, huge in terms of historical significance. Worlds collide. Worlds collide. This set in motion, as I just described, Europeans becoming aware of some new world that existed. And it created this interchange of people, goods, diseases from European, Africa, and the Americans that are termed the Columbian Exchange. So I can't stress enough the impact of Columbus's voyages to the New World. Again, looking for a westward route to Asia, comes into contact with some islands, and then later Central and South America in his 3rd and 4th voyages, and sets in motion, again, all these Europeans following after him, searching and exploring more detailed, and taking back with them things to Europe and Africa, and the transference of people, goods, and diseases throughout Europe, Africa, and America set in motion as a result of his voyages. And this, again, they use his name to connotate this, the Columbian Exchange. Here is a kind of image graph thing, not a graph, some sort of graphic image that illustrates the Columbian Exchange, the concept. So things such as pumpkins, potatoes, turkeys, tomatoes, corn, cocoa, pineapples, tobacco, vanilla. None of these things Europeans ever had. These were all products, crops of the New World, of North and South America. So the Columbian Exchange brought all of these things to Europe and then even to Africa. In exchange, Europeans brought things like grapes, banana, sugar cane, you can see peaches, pears, etc., citrus fruits, to the New World. So all of these different foods get transferred. Also animals. In the New World here, there were no horses, there were no sheep, there were no domesticated animals, I think, except the llama, and there was one other one, but I can't remember what it was, but primarily just the llama. But in North America, there were no horses, cows, pigs, and that's going to be a big deal we'll get to in a minute, the significance of not having those things. So these are the kind of things Columbus's voyages set in motion, the transference of all of these types of things, of different types of foods, different types of animals, and different kinds of diseases, which we'll get to in a minute, which had a devastating effect primarily on the peoples of the Americas. Now, once Portugal and Spain now are involved in New World exploration, they don't want to kind of fight and bicker and disagree over claimed territory, so the Pope gets involved. Both of these were Catholic countries, Portugal and Spain, and comes up with the Treaty of Tordesillas and divided basically the world in two and said everything west of this line that you see here was supposed to belong to Spain, and everything east would be Portugal, because again, Portugal had been the one going south and claiming islands out here and going down into Asia and stuff like that, and India and China. So that was all going to be Portuguese, everything here. But they had also, in going west to try to go down, had come into contact with South America and established the colony of Brazil. And you can see they even established and pushed Brazil farther south of this, or west of the line. But in any case, the Pope tried to divide the world in two in the early era of the age of exploration and said, Portugal, you can have the east, Spain, the west. Of course, other countries, the Dutch, the French, and the English ignore this, and they will soon follow in their exploration, sending their own people to search out and try to claim lands in the New World, which we'll learn about. Here are some other explorers that followed Columbus and the Portuguese people. The most famous two that we'll just talk about briefly, John Cabot and Amerigo Vespucci. John Cabot was, again, a person from the same hometown as Columbus. He was from Genoa in what is today present-day Italy, but he sailed for England. And Amerigo Vespucci was another Italian. He sailed on some voyages. He did not captain the voyages, but accompanied some voyages of Portugal and later Spain. And it is from his name that the continents get their name. The Americas are named after this man. He created the basis, it was his observations and stuff, for the first European maps of this new world. And so they were given his name. America is after Amerigo. And here is a version of an early map, and you see a kind of an unawareness. Here are the Americas, according to their first map. So they're not really accurate in their shape or what we now know, but this is an early map, the earliest map based on Amerigo Vespucci's observations and map-making stuff. So again, the Americas get their name from this guy. Let's talk briefly about Spanish motivations. Most history classes, they give you this catchy little thing to remember them, the 3 G's, gold, God, and glory. Gold obviously means Spaniards were interested in accumulating riches. We will soon find out when they conquered the Aztecs, they came into large amounts of gold, and that spurred other explorers, other Spaniards, other peoples, we'll see, to try to conquer other native peoples because they think they're all going to have gold. And so they're looking to kind of get rich quick. There must be lots of gold in the Americas. The Aztecs had it. Everybody must have it. So gold and even silver. God is, as I mentioned earlier, this desire to spread Catholicism. Okay, a lot of these people, Columbus, for instance, was a devout Catholic, and they think they are doing God's work in taking over these lands and trying to convert these pagan, heathen people that they encounter. And finally, glory. Spain will become, because of their New World conquests, the richest, most powerful nation in the world for a while. And this is at a time when they're competing, especially against England, to be kind of top dog in the world. So again, the Spanish motivations, and also you could even say individual glory. If you are someone like we'll talk about in a minute, Cortez, he became the richest individual in Spain thanks to, and maybe the most well-known, thanks to his exploits in the New World, his conquering of the Aztecs. But if you look at this picture here, very telling, you see right here a cross being erected behind Spaniards coming into contact with native people. And the other thing to notice here is the difference, the striking difference in attire. You see kind of scantily clad native people, and you see heavily clothed Europeans with their guns and, you know, steel hats and things like that. So this is a great image. It shows you the contrast between native people and the Spaniards, and also gives you an indication on the religious component to Spanish motivation for colonizing the New World. So the 3 G's, try to remember that: Spanish motivations, gold, God, glory. The types of Spaniards that came over in their initial wave of conquering and colonizing the New World were conquistadors, which translates to conquerors. So these were men. Almost all the early Spaniards that came over were men, and these were people that were in search, again, of adventure, of enriching themselves, glory, you know, the whole thing, doing something for God, all of these things. Now, why they were successful is a huge, huge historical question, because the Spaniards were able to conquer, we're going to find out in a minute, great empires like the Aztecs and the Incas with very small amounts of people. A couple hundred conquistadors will conquer hundreds of thousands of, well, thousands of Aztecs. And people, you know, hopefully you would think, why? How could a small amount of people conquer a much greater amount of people? And the answer for this, and there's a book, well-known book that some of you might be aware of, is it's titled this, Guns, Germs, Steel. So the Europeans advantage superior technology, especially the ability to have steel, but also germs. They were able to spread disease unintentionally. Just they carried diseases that they were immune to, but that the people of the Americas had never been too exposed to, and it wiped out the vast majority of native people that the Spaniards would come into contact with. And we'll talk about that shortly. So the most famous of the conquistadors was probably this man, Hernan Cortez. Sometimes you'll see his name spelled with a Z rather than an S at the end, but I'm just going to go with this one. And he had been part of the Spanish group of people in Cuba, and then he on his own decided to go looking. There had been rumors, they had heard about this great empire, the Aztec Empire here, and he decided, hey, I'm going to go try to take them down and enrich myself, because you're always supposed to, you could get how these guys are paid or whatever they can kind of acquire, okay, and they just have to give part to the crown, but they get the majority of whatever they can get. So he decides he's going to go off. He angers his superior, the guy that was the governor of Cuba, because he wanted to go do it. And Cortez took some guys and just went himself. And you can see his route. And here's where he finds the Aztecs, and then eventually defeats them and amasses great riches because of it. And at the time of his death, he was the wealthiest man in Spain. Here is an artist depiction of Cortez meeting Montezuma, who was the king of the Aztecs. Now, there are a lot of different stories about how Cortez was able to get to the Aztecs. Some people said there was this myth that the Aztecs had and they thought he was some returning god. Most people dispute that now. Most people think Montezuma just misplayed this whole thing, and that they recognized, they definitely had, that the Spaniards had power, that they had firearms, they had horses, they had things, and they were definitely not ordinary people, and that Montezuma was a little misguided in allowing Cortez and his people to get into their main city without killing him early on. Sometimes you will hear, though, this myth that the Aztecs thought Cortez was a returning god, and that's why they didn't kill him and let him into their midst, where he then captured Montezuma and kind of held him hostage and did things, eventually kills him, and then was able to take over all of the Aztecs. Following on Cortez, the other most well-known conquistador was Pizarro, who conquered the Inca, and I believe he only had 180 people. And this is a famous painting of Pizarro, I don't know how accurate it is, pulling down Atahualpa, who was the king of the Incas. The Incas also considered him to be a living god, so they thought their king was a living god, and he's on what's called a litter. And the account of this battle from Spaniards, he's so holy he wasn't supposed to touch the ground. So as the Spaniards are killing the people holding it up, other people would run to keep him up off the ground. But finally Pizarro was able to capture him. The other great thing about this painting, this artist depiction, again, you see the religious component. Here's a priest in the midst of this battle. Again, I don't know how accurate this is, but you see him holding up the cross. So again, I can't stress enough the religious component. It wasn't just searching for gold and greed, that was a part of it, but also the religious component of spreading Catholicism and instilling it into these kind of pagan, heathen peoples that they were encountering. But here, after the battle, and Pizarro's actually able to capture Atahualpa, he held him hostage. He demanded that the Incas, if they wanted him back, they would have to fill a room, probably the size of, I think, a classroom, full of gold from floor to ceiling, and they did that, and then Pizarro still killed Atahualpa and ultimately conquered the Incas. So he did not really keep his word. He demanded all this gold and then killed Atahualpa, the king of the Incas anyway, but well, that's how it went down. So again, this is Cortez, Pizarro, probably the two most famous of the conquistadors. Now, earlier, these slides are a little out of order maybe. I talked about, historians have often asked why the conquistadors were able to have so much success over vastly greater amounts of people when they took on the Aztecs or the Incas. And again, guns, germs, and steel, superior technology, but the biggest thing was diseases. And the biggest disease that they spread was smallpox. Smallpox is a debilitating disease. Here in these images drawn by an Aztec, you can see they cause horrible pustule blisters all over your body. And if you survive having smallpox, usually you're hugely, you have a tremendous amount of scars in your body from having all these blisters. So people that survive smallpox are generally very scarred for life. But most of the people that got smallpox, contracted it from the Europeans, died. And this was the biggest thing. So they'd come in and spread this disease, and very quickly all the people, or huge percentages of the native peoples would die. Now, if you don't know why Europeans were immune to the diseases and people in the Americas were not, it has to do with the fact that the Europeans had lots of domesticated animals and the people in the New World did not. So earlier I told you in the Columbian Exchange that things like horses, cows, pigs, sheep, those were not in the New World prior to Europeans coming. The Europeans brought those. So the people in the Americas had never lived amongst those animals, and therefore they had never been exposed to the diseases that came from those animals. Whereas the people in Europe had lived amongst those animals for thousands of years and had been exposed to diseases that had started with the animals that they lived with. And sure, if you don't, well, go back to shore. Hopefully at some point in a science class you learned about how diseases are spread, and people get diseases, but then if you don't die from it or after you're sick, your body fights it off and then becomes immune to that disease. You still have the disease in you, but your body, which is remarkable, has adapted to it. And if it hasn't killed you, your body figures out a way to get better and to live with that disease in you. And then your offspring are immune to these diseases most of the time, but are, even though they're exposed, have them on them. So when the Europeans came here, they had for centuries been exposed to things like smallpox, influenza, typhus, and so they're carrying these diseases. They don't harm them, but they came to the Americas, and when they encounter Native Americans, the Native Americans get very sick because these people had never been exposed to those diseases because they had never had the same domesticated animals that the Europeans had had. Like I said, they had the llama, and there's one other one that I keep forgetting. Every year I keep forgetting what the other one is. But most native peoples in the Americas had no domesticated animals, whereas the Europeans, again, had all these domesticated animals. That's where the diseases came from. The Europeans had built up immunities, but carried the diseases, and when they came to the Americas, devastating effect. Now, of course, the Spaniards, how do you think they interpret this? They come and all these people start getting sick and dropping dead because they don't know they're carrying the diseases. The Spaniards don't know. Well, wipe them out with the diseases we have on us. They don't know that. They think, I'll give you a couple seconds to think. Hopefully you said God. Again, I told you most of these people are devout Catholics and think there's a religious component to all this. God is doing this to the native people, striking them down to allow the Spaniards to conquer them. The real thing was, again, that they were immune to these diseases. The natives had never been exposed to them ever because they lacked domesticated animals. And the rest is history. So that's the biggest reason why conquistadors were able to conquer the people of Central and South America, was mostly disease, and smallpox the biggest one. So after the conquistadors have been going for a while, you see they establish in the New World New Spain. And here it is at its height here, and you can see this again is Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony. This, which was larger than present-day Brazil. But here you see New Spain, after a while, stretched all the way from the bottom of South America, all of Central America, and most of the Caribbean, and all the way into the vast majority of what is today the United States. All the way, everything west of the Mississippi, and Florida and Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana down there. So at the height of Spanish activities in the New World, they controlled the vast majority of the Americas here. Now, Spanish interaction with the natives, a lot of modern people tend to look very critically on how Spain interacted with the natives. One thing I think most of you probably would realize is that the Spaniards viewed the natives as these very inferior people. They did not have the kind of sensibilities that we do in the 21st century, that there are different types of people and kind of sensitivity towards other beliefs and cultures. Not at all. These were very different times, and the Spaniards were not alone. Almost all the European countries that came to the Americas viewed the natives they came into contact with as inferior people because of the nature of their lives. So the fact that they especially did not wear a lot of clothing, but one of the biggest things, of course, was their religious practices and beliefs were very different than the Europeans. So the Spaniards in particular, once they would conquer native peoples, were insistent that they gave up, renounced their previous religious practices and beliefs, and accepted Catholicism. If they didn't, as evidenced in this diagram, this illustration right here, you can see they're lighting this guy on fire because he would not renounce his beliefs and convert to Catholicism. So they viewed the natives as inferior. They view them as pagans, of doing things that go against their of the Catholic beliefs. So worshiping idols, having different gods, things like that were big no-nos to Catholics. So the Catholics were very insistent. Again, there's a huge religious component to the Spanish activities in the New World, and they would conquer people and insist that they adopt to Catholicism, and if not, they would be punished harshly, even killed, or at least whipped often if there was some transgression. There are all these accounts of people like caught secretly trying to do their old religious stuff and being whipped a bunch, you know. But if it was really bad, they would kill them, as this guy's being burned here. Also, they forced the natives to work for them. They viewed the natives, and again, not just the Spaniards, a lot of Europeans, as lazy, because the hunter-gatherer kind of nature of a lot of their, well, not hunter-gatherer, but just the nature of their lives weren't the same as Europeans. They didn't seem to be hustling, and they seemed lazy a lot of times. So the Spaniards would force natives to work, usually, again, in activities like mining for gold and silver, and force them to convert to Catholicism. And again, both of these by force. They're not asking them, hey, you want to sign up? And hey, would you like to convert? They're forcing people to do this after they've conquered them militarily. And again, after many of the people have died. And again, that's a selling point too. They would say, look, our God has killed all of you people, so you better sign up to our religion. You better start following ours, or else, you know, our God's more powerful, that kind of thing. And again, they justify the harsh treatment on the fact that the natives were not Christians. So they don't believe in the same God. They're going to hell anyway. They're not equals in any way, shape, or form. And they treated them, by our standards, I think we would say, very harshly. The Spaniards treated native peoples very harshly. Here are some images that might be blurry. This one's very telling here. One of the things I just got done saying was Spaniards forced native peoples to work in mines. And if they did not, they would give them quotas. And they would say, if you do not, you know, bring back X amount of gold, X amount of silver, you're going to be in trouble. And here you see a guy's getting his arm hacked off. So they would do things like this. If you did not meet your quota, you would be punished. You would have your arm chopped off, or you would be killed. And again, this is to let the native people know they mean business. Now to us, I'm sure this is a repulsive, horrifying thing. A lot of the things we're going to go over in the colonial era, and again, not just with Spain, but when we get to the English and even their treatment of themselves, this was a different world. The 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, people, it was a much more brutal world. People had valued human life less. Punishments for things were often physical mutilation, and it was crazy compared to, I think, our sensibilities now. But here again, you see people getting their arms hacked off for not meeting their quota of getting gold for the Spaniards. And this picture over here is just another picture that shows, again, the great difference in culture between Europeans who are heavily clothed, facial hair, and native peoples who, in this illustration here, are wearing almost nothing. So great cultural difference, and because the Spaniards had disease and superior armaments, they were able to instill their will on these other people who they view as inferior, and their views and religious practices as pagan and dangerous. And so they don't value these people, and they're very different, And because the Spaniards can dominate them with the weapons and the diseases they bring, they instill their views, force the native people to accept them or get punished or killed. Here's the same picture. Okay, because of disease, after a while there are no native people or so few left to meet the labor demands of the Spaniards. They themselves aren't going to go work in mines or grow sugar. They start to bring over slaves from Africa. The Portuguese had as well, into Brazil. So again, slaves start to come to Spanish North America, New Spain, because of the tremendous loss of native life due to diseases. There are so few natives then left to do the physical work that none of the Spaniards want to do. They then start to get, again, the slaves from Africa and bring them to the New World, and this kind of completes finally the Columbian exchange. So we talked about people coming from Europe and goods and crops and animals. Now we have people, and now we have not just Europe and the Americas, but also Africa involved in this exchange across the Atlantic, again known as the Columbian Exchange. But again, the turn to slaves from Africa is once diseases wreak havoc amongst native people and decimate them so much that there's often a shortage of workforce. And so the Spaniards and Portuguese have to look towards other people to meet that need as a labor force. The types of settlements for the Spaniards in the Americas, missions, which I assume most of you are familiar, pictured here throughout California. There are still many missions, and many of the big cities, especially in Southern California, were originally missions. They were Catholic priests who would come to the New World and set up a mission and try to convert, again, and save the native peoples. Presidios are military forts, usually very close to a mission, to protect it. If it was just a mission, the native people might just kill the priests. But the presidio would be there to protect the priests and the Spanish settlers from not only native people, but also other Europeans, because other Europeans will come after the Spaniards, and if there's only a small scattering, they're going to try to kill the Spaniards so they can take it over. So the presidios, again, are not only to protect and dominate local native peoples, to protect the Spaniards against local native peoples, but also other Europeans who might want to try to claim the territory as well. Haciendas are big ranches that were formed. So Spaniards would come over, they would get large tracts of land, and then again try to get native peoples to work on them, much like ancient feudalism in Europe. One of the big priests involved in the mission system, especially in what is today California, probably the preeminent priest in this endeavor to convert native peoples to Catholicism, was Junipero Serra. And in Statutory Hall in Congress, if you go to Washington, D.C., in the Capitol, there's a place called Statutory Hall. And in this, each state has 2 statues of great people historically from that state. And one of the 2 people representing California is Father Serra. He's one of the 2 statues. I believe the other one now is Ronald Reagan, if I'm not mistaken. But there's a statue of him in the Capitol of Washington, D.C. He was the most prominent, again, priest in establishing missions throughout California. The first one he set up was in San Diego. He then, what is today San Diego, and then started many more. Racial intermixing was a huge part of Spanish colonization of the New World. The vast, vast majority of Spaniards that came to the New World were men. Not women, not families. Most of them were men, adventurers. And so looking for female companionship, wanting families, they then intermixed with native peoples. And as we went over in world history last year, or hopefully you did if you had a different class, you learned about the different kind of levels of racial intermixing and this racial hierarchy that existed in Latin America of peninsulars, mestizos, creoles, mulattoes, all these different categories depending on